can't.
I will be the last, and you will go first.
There are others. I can show you, please. Please.
Baldur's Gate is an isometric real-time with pause computer role-playing game developed by BioWare Corporation and published in December 1998 by Interplay Entertainment. The game is an adaptation of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition rules, and takes place in the high fantasy Forgotten Realms campaign setting. Players will explore Faerun's treacherous Sword Coast, where they become enmeshed in a conspiracy that reaches from the bowels of the Nashkel mines to the spires of Baldur's Gate. Along the way, they'll be battling fearsome monsters and scouring dungeons via a real-time round-based combat system that can also be played in a pseudo-turn-based mode. The game spans more than 50 unique locations and offers over 100 different quests for the players to complete. Quests can be resolved according to the player character's personal values, like choosing between opposing sides or blackmailing the quest giver for further rewards. But watch out, because the world will react to your decisions. Baldur's Gate was designed around parties of up to 6 adventurers, letting players recruit from a colourful array of heroes and villains whose morals and motivations could conflict with their own. Baldur's Gate became a smash hit upon release, rocketing past publisher Interplay's sales expectations and remaining one of the global top 10 sellers for months afterwards. The critical response was similarly positive, with fans raving about the game and reviewers showering the title with awards. PC Gamer called it a beautiful, involving, old-school RPG, whilst their American counterpart lauded it as every role-playing gamer's dream and the new king of the genre. PC Zone commented that Baldur's Gate boasted visuals far and above its competitors, as well as recommending it as a deeper, more hardcore alternative to Diablo. PC Powerplay called the game a real role-player's RPG, whilst GameSpot's Deslock said that Baldur's Gate was easily the best computer adaptation of AD&D ever made, and returns CRPGs to the forefront of gaming. But reviews were not universally positive. One of the less enthusiastic reviewers was Computer Gaming World's infamous iconoclast Scorpia, who characterized the game's questing as dreary, intimated that the developer had mistuned the AD&D rules, and claimed that the game was clearly designed to be a multiplayer experience. Whilst Scorpia was certainly one of the most negative critics, some of her other complaints were echoed by more positive reviews. PC Powerplay suggested that the inflexible AD&D rules kept the game from matching the interactivity of Ultima 7, or the role-playing options of Fallout 2. PC Gamer and PC Format both observed that Baldur's Gate's, quote, beardiness might turn off the average player. The majority of reviews were also critical of the game's frustrating pathfinding bugs and inadequate quest journal, and most pointed out that it was extremely difficult to play the game in fully real-time mode without resorting to pausing. One criticism that would really stick with BioWare and Interplay was that Baldur's Gate couldn't match the epic story, compelling side characters, and stunning production values of the recently ported Final Fantasy VII. Nevertheless, Baldur's Gate was already dominating top 10 lists, being declared RPG of the Year by many publications, and it was soon appearing in fan polls and editorial picks as one of the greatest RPGs ever made. The game was quickly followed up with a mission pack entitled Tales of the Sword Coast, which raised the maximum character level, implemented some quality of life improvements, and added the new quest hub of Ugloth's Beard. There, players could charter a ship to the fabled Balduran's Isle, or sign on to a tour of the cursed Durlag's Tower. BioWare would release a sequel to Baldur's Gate in the year 2000, and brought the series to a definitive conclusion in 2001 with the Throne of Bhaal expansion pack. The Infinity Engine itself would be used in several other Interplay published titles, such as Planescape Torment and the Icewind Dale series, as well as BioWare's own cancelled martial arts RPG, Five Fingers of Death. The Baldur's Gate name would also live on in spin-off titles and other media, most notably the pen and paper adventure Heroes of Baldur's Gate, which was written by James Olin, Baldur's Gate's lead designer. Finally, the original games would enjoy a revival in 2012 with the release of Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition, developed by BioWare founder Trent Oster's Beamdog Software. This version of the game was later ported to iOS, Android, and console, and was supported by future content releases such as the Black Pits Arena mode and the Siege of Dragonspear expansion pack. Unfortunately, the enhanced editions make a number of significant changes to various aspects of the original game, so as with my Icewind Dale retrospective, I won't be using them as the basis for this video.
I guess so. My part in it, I wouldn't say I don't have a. I can't. I mean, other than I also am the guy who named it Baldur's Gate, and I still have an email from Ray that says it's the stupidest name ever.
Baldur's Gate began life in January 1996 as a proof-of-concept demo for Battleground Infinity, a real-time, isometric, massively multiplayer RPG set during a multiplanar Ragnarok. Each player would pick a lesser deity from a diverse range of mythological backgrounds and struggle for supremacy across the battlefields of time and space. The so-called Infinity Engine that powered the demo was a daring piece of tech. Whereas most large game worlds at the time were constructed from thousands of individual tiles, BioWare's tech lead Scott Grieg had experimented with Microsoft's new DirectX development kit to create a single scrollable background render that impressed everyone who saw it. Though the team was inexperienced, the speed at which technology was changing helped them outpace larger, more established developers using older engines. But prospective publishers were baffled by the demo, and skeptical of this small company's ability to pull off a massively multiplayer game. BioWare first pitched the game to Interplay Entertainment, who had published Shattered Steel, the developer's first title. Interplay's Fergus Urquhart, who had recently founded an internal studio under the name Black Isle, observed that Battleground Infinity seemed to play less like an RPG and more like the then-nascent real-time strategy genre. But Interplay had recently acquired the license to publish titles based on the Dungeons & Dragons pen and paper game, and the next time they met with BioWare, they had a proposal. Since BioWare were already creating an RTS-style party-driven fantasy role-playing game, why not make it an official AD&D title? BioWare leaped at the opportunity. Grieg and the company's founders were obsessed with Dungeons & Dragons, and lead designer James Olin was something of a local legend as a dungeon master. This new single-player project became known simply as Forgotten Realms, and was to be set in the wild and unpredictable lands of the Sword Coast, at the time a relatively undeveloped area in the setting. This gave the team more freedom than they might otherwise have had with more popular locations like Waterdeep. But before they could proceed, BioWare had to resolve internal tensions over the idea of translating the classic turn-based pen and paper rules into real-time gameplay. Some at BioWare, like founder Ray Musaka, viewed D&D's turn-based mechanics as sacrosanct, and had hoped the project would be the spiritual successor to the turn-based tactical combat of the gold box CRPGs with which they'd grown up. But others, led by James Olin, countered that turn-based RPGs were too dated for contemporary audiences, and that the exciting, fast-paced real-time tactics of Command & Conquer and the emerging RTS genre were the future. The two factions reached a compromise in which action would be real-time, but predicated on a round-based system that could be paused when the player needed to take a moment to assess things. The developer would later characterize their design philosophy on the game as BioWare's 4 pillars: the desire to recapture the exploration of the Ultima series, the tactical combat of the Gold Box games, the presence and reactivity of Jagged Alliance's characters, and the sense of progression from the Arcania series. As Forgotten Realms development gained speed, Interplay would assign senior staff from Black Isle Studios to help oversee the project. Producer Chris Parker would periodically visit BioWare to help guide the team, and would make daily calls to Ray Musaka for updates on its progress. Parker and Black Isle head Fergus Urquhart also pushed BioWare to standardize a tool set for development on the Infinity Engine, recalling their experience with the Fallout games, in which, as Parker put it, when you went to 6 different areas, they were made by 6 different designers with 6 different kinds of doors. But aside from this, Interplay offered little assistance beyond the minimum expected of a publisher. Computer role-playing games had fallen far since the halcyon days of the late 80s and early 90s, with stagnating design, increasing development costs, and higher graphical and technological expectations from audiences, steering many developers towards newer trends. Though a niche remained for established franchises like the Might and Magic series, most observers considered the future of role-playing games to lie in Japan, with the more accessible, cinematic, story-driven JRPG. Interplay's expectations for Forgotten Realms were low, with their UK division not even bothering to prepare sales forecasts for the title. Besides, the publisher had far more riding on internal AD&D projects, like the catastrophic developmental Hindenburg that was Descent to Undermountain. Early reports indicated that the game was intended for a 1997 release, but BioWare were rocked by the release of Blizzard's Diablo in December 1996. According to Trent Oster, development slowed to a crawl as the team spent one sleepless night after another playing through it, and BioWare realised that their own project would need to go through many more iterations before it could come close to competing.
Fresh meat.
Gaming publications started to take real notice of Forgotten Realms in early 1997. At this stage, there was still uncertainty over certain aspects of the game, such as confusion over maximum party sizes and whether the story would be continued in sequels or so-called mission packs. The final name of the game was also still in flux, with Forgotten Realms briefly taking the working title of Bloodline, then officially referred to as Iron Throne for the next few months. And BioWare's desire to match the bar set by the competitors meant previous standards for the game's visuals were no longer enough. Art was completely overhauled at least 3 times during development, often resulting in inconsistencies across assets, like character sprites being too small for the environment. But though the release date was continually pushed back, from August 1997 to September to winter and beyond, things had begun to fall into place, with the project picking up the final title of Baldur's Gate and being demoed to the gaming press.
Hello, fellow wayfarers. Welcome to Baldur's Gate.
Print and online publications began to get excited about Baldur's Gate, grilling BioWare for more info. In interviews, Ray Musaka promised that Baldur's Gate would be more structured than Bethesda Studios' Daggerfall, but also more hardcore and faithful to the true RPG experience than Diablo, which he likened to a fantasy version of the isometric shooter Crusader No Remorse. But behind the scenes, the world of Baldur's Gate had more in common with Daggerfall than Musaka would perhaps like to admit. The downsides of passion and enthusiasm, untempered by experience, were showing. Interplay's testers played through the game's side content and came back with reports of big, beautiful outdoor locations that were completely empty. Many of these massive areas were still lacking content, and BioWare went into overdrive trying to churn out new quests and NPCs to fill them. Staff at BioWare could mine from several lifetimes worth of tabletop gaming experiences. Designers like Lucas Christiansen wrote quests and NPCs based on years of playing D&D with friends and colleagues. The now iconic Minsk had originally been founder Cameron Topher's tabletop character, whilst the Red Wizard Edwin was the creation of one of James Oland's friends. But with thousands of hours of pen and paper adventures to draw from, the writers would conceive quests, characters, and lengthy dialogue interactions that neither BioWare nor Interplay could actually afford to realise. As James Oland put it, what you write on a page takes 10 seconds, but all the resources that have to go into that become tens of thousands of dollars of assets. Painful cuts had to be made. Interplay's testers also exposed cracks in the game's foundation of RTS action crossed with AD&D rules. BioWare's powerful BG script was more than capable of programming enemies with advanced battle tactics, like prioritizing unarmored targets or exploiting ranged weapons. But combining real-time action with AD&D combat meant that testers would see their thieves and spellcasters killed within seconds of starting combat, with few options at low levels to counter this. BioWare had to simplify the AI's decision-making process, but this, in turn, made them easier to manipulate with simple tactics like kiting or summon spam. Even as development steamed into 1998, Interplay had further demands for Baldur's Gate, including implementing an online multiplayer mode. This necessitated further delays and more funding. Other points of tension included BioWare's heavy advertising of the Infinity Engine, with Interplay warning them not to try and use their marketing resources as a sales pitch for the engine. Interplay also tried to push BioWare into making the game more appealing to RTS fans. For example, according to co-founder Augustine Year, they wanted a Warcraft 2-like interface, and we had to explain, sort of vehemently, that this is not that type of game. This is a role-playing game, and it is Dungeons and Dragons. As development entered its final months and the last ads began to appear in magazines, privately, Interplay was still not bullish about Baldur's Gate. Their marketing department, projecting sales of a mere 100,000 units, refused to bother creating a website for the game's release, so Chris Parker took it upon himself to design one from scratch. Similarly, the game was meant to receive a tie-in novelization by TSR writer Philip Athens, but Athens only had a few weeks to submit his first draft, and was working from an outdated script for the game's story. According to Athens, Interplay made minimal effort to synchronize the novel with BioWare's evolving script, with the author finally receiving a buggy, broken alpha of Baldur's Gate right after the novel had already gone to print. With a Christmas 1998 release approaching, Baldur's Gate had gone from a blip on the radar to what was now being called the most anticipated RPG release of the year. BioWare crossed their fingers. The team had more faith in their work than Interplay, internally hoping for sales of at least 200,000 units to ensure a sequel, but for many it was a nerve-wracking experience. Aside from veterans of Shattered Steel, few at BioWare's 50-person team had worked in the games industry prior to Baldur's Gate. Over at Black Isle, Fergus Urquhart and Chris Parker, who had spent years fighting for the game, were steadfast, insistent that the game would be a hit. At last, the day of release came. Initial sales were a modest success, but word of the game was soon spreading among RPG fans, and the rest is history. The game was such an unexpected success that stock was selling out before it had even physically hit the retailers' shelves, and Interplay staff had to give up their winter vacations to try and fix supply shortages. For BioWare's founders, the journey from Battleground Infinity to Baldur's Gate had helped them realise the realities of game development and their priorities in life. Augustin Yer departed the company to return to practicing medicine, whilst Musaka, Zeschuk and Oster would stay on with BioWare and go on to even more ambitious projects.
Are you looking at me?
As with the classic pen and paper game, players start Baldur's Gate by choosing their race and gender, picking a class, and rolling for their stats. Races are the standard fantasy lineup: humans, elves, dwarves, and so on, with relatively small racial differences, like dwarves being hardier, halflings being light-fingered, and so forth. The major difference between humans and more exotic races is that human characters cannot multi-class, that is, start the game as a hybrid class, but they can dual class later in the game, essentially pausing their current class progression to gain levels as an alternative class. The classes themselves cover all the standard adventuring archetypes, various flavours of fighters, thieves, mages, and clerics, and in line with old-school D&D, their roles are relatively fixed. Fighters are there to stand their ground and reliably deliver physical damage. Thieves open locks, disarm traps, and scout. Mages are fragile, but can easily turn the tide of battle with their spells, and clerics heal wounds, cure ailments, and cast supporting magic. There are also a handful of classes that fit less snugly into this paradigm, like the Bard, who can dabble in the responsibilities of other professions and buff the party with their music, or the Druid, whose spells and abilities are rooted in their relationship with the natural world. A character's chosen class will dictate their basic abilities. Fighters can use virtually any type of weapon or armour, but can't cast spells or use stealth. Mages can't wear armour and have an extremely limited choice of weapons, but can utilise magic scrolls and wands. Druids can't use metallic gear, and so on. So once a character's class is determined, they're already pigeonholed into pretty strict gameplay roles. This system means that once on the stats screen, the player wants a high score in the stats that directly influence their combat roles. So fighters want good strength, dexterity, and constitution for physical combat and survivability, whilst clerics need high wisdom to be able to cast more spells. In Baldur's Gate, you can roll for stats as many times as you like, and then move points from one stat to another once you feel you have a good baseline. Once you've rolled your stats and accepted your character, that's it. There's no in-game mechanic for resetting your skills or stat points or anything so forgiving. This kind of system inevitably leads to the phenomenon of dump stats, in which practically minded players will pump all their stat points into the most important stats for their class, leaving less relevant stats at comically low levels. Stats like charisma and intelligence do have some relevance to mechanics like NPC reactions, and the original manual claims they improve defense against mind-altering spells. But Baldur's Gate's heavy combat emphasis means that from a pragmatic perspective, it's tough to justify designing a character around anything except their combat functionality. Once you actually enter combat, players will get a sense of why Baldur's Gate is typically viewed as leaning more towards tactical RPG gameplay than the exciting hack and slash of Diablo clones. Basic combat is similar to that of a contemporary RTS. Entities waddle over to each other and automatically swing away until one of them drops. There is a morale system, but it's not particularly relevant until you're already winning or losing, unless short-circuited by spells. There are no special attacks, stances, or much in the way of sophisticated tactical maneuvers. In classic RTS, this straightforward and simplistic combat is fine, since the player has other demands on their attention beyond the immediate battle. So what's the point of this in Baldur's Gate? Well, it's made very clear in both the manual and repeated in-game reminders that the experience is not designed around controlling a single hero, but a full party of adventurers. Being faithful to the classic D&D experience, the game doesn't mandate anything quite so strict as the MMO Holy Trinity. It's absolutely possible to play through Baldur's Gate with any wacky combination of classes. But the game does encourage forming a group that can meet the demands of a typical dungeon crawl, that being a hardy core of warriors, a thief, and some level of spellcasting ability. The mechanical appeal of Baldur's Gate is in overcoming challenges by leveraging the varied and diverse abilities available to a well-balanced adventuring party. A cloaked ranger might act as a spotter for magical artillery. A thief could neutralize squishier foes before the fight has even begun. A cleric can bottleneck a corridor with his puppets, whilst the fighters pour arrows into the fray. Baldur's Gate is full of difficult set-piece battles that force the player to experiment with the full range of their tactical options. Basic combat doesn't need to be sophisticated, and indeed probably shouldn't be, because the complexity comes from managing multiple characters, especially spellcasters who have the widest array of possible options to assist the party. Now, this concept of combat that was not only tactical, but also faithful to the rules, and conducted in real time, had its detractors even back in the day. A full year before Iron Throne's release, Ray Muzaka was challenged as to how a complicated turn-based system could be translated to real time. Indeed, a common criticism today is that if Baldur's Gate's combat is designed to be tactically engaging, it should have remained turn-based, since, as Trent Oster later admitted, many of the game's real-time encounters are just too difficult without resorting to pausing anyway. BioWare heavily promoted their customizable party scripts, and these certainly have an impressive array of options, but I wouldn't recommend relying on them unless you're willing to lower the difficulty level. Now, back in that 1997 interview, Ray Muzaka defended real-time with pause by pointing out that computers could swiftly automate a lot of the calculations that slowed down P&P combat. He added that this system was more exciting because more could be happening at once, and he said that at the end of the day, a good RPG should be fun. James Olin, who had championed real-time with pause during the game's development, likened the experience to setting up little movie scenes and watching them come to life. all of his actions would play out. Characters moved, fireballs and lightning bolts scorched and zapped. Swords clash, screams pierced the air, and enemy bodies dropped to the ground. In my case, the real-time with pause system is the main reason I played Baldur's Gate in the first place. Whilst I'd played a few turn-based RPGs in the 90s, I found turn-based combat quite dull and detrimental to immersion. So a traditional turn-based system being translated to real-time action was very exciting at the time, and I find it just as fun today. But I'll be the first to admit that Baldur's Gate's combat only works as a full package, with the right party, and with encounter design that brings out its strengths and mitigates its weaknesses. Because Baldur's Gate isn't just a series of unrelated set-piece battles, it's an adventure. A journey up and down the Sword Coast, at the start of which the player is a snot-nosed level 1 greenhorn. And low-level D&D combat is where the player's options are at their most limited. For example, a first-level spellcaster in Baldur's Gate can only cast a couple of spells before they need to rest and re-memorize them, and the mage class has to actually find and transcribe these spells before they can even use them. In the pen and paper game, this is somewhat mitigated by the fact that spellcasters have other functions beyond fighting, and tabletop adventures involve fewer combat encounters. But Baldur's Gate's maps, both wilderness and dungeons, are pretty densely packed with hostile wildlife. A mage could blow all their spells on the first pack of gibberlings they see, but then they'd have to spend the rest of the day as dead weight. Resource management is fine. A rough and ready fighter should be more suited to dealing with mundane encounters than a bookish wizard, but there are so many enemies in Baldur's Gate that a lot of your time is spent sitting back watching the melee fighters chopping through trash mobs. So the game's combat system is designed around the complexity of a full party, but the game's pacing discourages making full use of your party's abilities. This led to the perception that warrior classes are too simplistic and are boring to play in Infinity Engine games. This popular perception of fighters has cast a long and enduring shadow over games designed around traditional party-based CRPG combat.
The biggest problem we have right now is we see a lot of players that focus on the melee classes, and they don't have enough things to do. This is not a criticism of D&D. D&D, the fighter class, is the tutorial class. So at the tabletop, it is used to teach you how to play, but as a result, it gives you limited things from the get-go.
Many years down the line, BioWare themselves tried to address this criticism by transplanting MMO-style cooldown rotation hotkey mashing into Dragon Age Origins, whilst Obsidian's Pillars of Eternity pigeonholed warriors into the role of tanks, whose responsibility was to soak up damage and manage aggro with various abilities. The success of these attempts is debatable, since a lot of these mechanics grew out of online games where each player controlled a single character, and since exciting real-time action was out of the question, people needed something else to do. As odd as it sounds, I think fighters should be boring in a game like Baldur's Gate. Whilst I'm definitely not opposed to giving them a couple of useful extra abilities, designers need to be wary of overcomplicating them and necessitating a fully turn-based system, or turning fights into a tedious routine of cooldown cycling. But low-level D&D combined with high-density combat encounters doesn't just gnaw at the player's attention span. They can also make it challenging to design a comfortable difficulty curve to match character progression. In Baldur's Gate, low-level characters can have anywhere between, say, 3 or 4 hit points as a wizard, and maybe 12 to 13 hit points as a fighter. Even as they level up, their hit point gain is randomized. So whilst a hardy fighter has a better chance of gaining a major boost to their health, a freak roll upon clicking the level up button will permanently limit their survivability. A character's armor class will reduce the chance of them taking damage, but it won't reduce the amount of damage they take from a successful strike. Death can come from anywhere on the Sword Coast, be it the jaws of a wolf or a bandit's arrow. Even with the right party setup, the low-level stats and inherent randomness of D&D mean that a party member can go from perfectly healthy to stone dead in a couple of seconds. Now, it's understandable, of course, that a hulking ogre can crush skulls with a single blow. But even enemies that are ostensibly the appropriate challenge level for your party can ruin your day with a couple of unlucky dice rolls. Some of the deadliest enemies are not warriors or warlocks, but packs of yipping kobolds, whose short bows can kill a party member within seconds of being sighted. In the second edition of the tabletop rules, there's an optional mechanic called Death's Door, where party members can be downed and start to bleed out rather than instantly dying.
I'm injured.
But Baldur's Gate uses the standard rule of 0 hit points, meaning a party member is dead as a doornail. The party will have to gather up their inventory, though mercifully not carry their physical body, and traipse over to the nearest temple to raise the dead. That's assuming, of course, the character wasn't permanently obliterated by a gibbing or other form of irreparable bodily harm, or was the protagonist, who cannot be revived from death. That a party will sometimes have to deal with death and its consequences is perfectly fine, but the ease and frequency with which party members can be slain is a real drag in such a combat-heavy game. There are plenty of ways to mitigate danger: scouting, preparation, constant pausing and repositioning of the party, and so on, but it's not always going to be enough. If a party member is killed by a stray arrow 10 seconds after entering a new wilderness map, the player is just going to reload their save. At the lowest level, combat is so deadly that there's an extremely strong incentive to avoid melee encounters entirely and focus on reliable, low-risk ranged attacks. Now, it's true that combat that is too balanced and too predictable can just end up being boring. And even at low levels, Baldur's Gate illustrates the benefits of its system, as the tide of battle can turn on a single successful spell or critical blow. There's no doubt that the mad unpredictability of grease, web, confusion, horror, and stinking cloud spells flying about is part of Baldur's Gate's charm. Chris Parker admitted that when implementing the second edition spells into Baldur's Gate, balance hadn't exactly been the priority, but rather, here's Dungeons and Dragons. Here's all of the spells. But part of what's great about the unexpected is how you react to it, how you adapt to the winds of fortune. In Baldur's Gate, an entire battle can hinge on a single dice roll. It's win or lose. It's difficult to react to a spell that freezes your whole party, nor is there much the enemy can do when the shoe is on the other foot. It's not until a bit later in the game, when health pools are larger and there are more items and spells for mitigating status effects, that the chaos of freak dice rolls can make things genuinely exciting, instead of just making you hit the reload button. Of course, to enjoy this side to Baldur's Gate, a player has to be willing to accept the inherent mercuriality of its pacing. Even if sticking religiously to the main quest, the player will not always experience a particularly smooth difficulty curve. Moreover, Baldur's Gate is not about following a linear path, but heading off into the uncharted wilderness in search of risk and riches, and there's no telling whether around the next corner is a band of pint-sized Zvarts, or a terrifying ogre mage. It's great that Baldur's Gate has such variety, and this is an important part of the overall experience. Rationing finite resources for harder battles, and protecting wounded companions from opportunistic scavengers. But it's fair to say that in every Baldur's Gate title, the player has to accept that sometimes they're going to get slaughtered for no reason. This isn't the malicious, deliberate murder of a player in order to frustrate them. It's just a consequence of combining Dungeons and Dragons with an unsympathetic dungeon master and non-linear exploration. Baldur's Gate could have been a more linear, curated experience. Baldur's Gate does actually have some level of dynamic scaling. Random enemy spawns, for example, are partly based on the number of party members and their current level, but most of the game exists in a fixed state, with irrelevant chaff wandering some areas and fearsome beasts lording over others. No matter how much the player hedges their bets, they're eventually going to stumble into something they can't handle. Sometimes that means running away. Sometimes it means limping back to a temple to revive half your party. But often it means that the player has to realise they should go somewhere less dangerous to level up first. Leveling up an underpowered party is a fairly standard feature of non-linear RPGs that don't rely on level scaling. Baldur's Gate can't really be said to feature grinding. There is no point in Baldur's Gate at which the player should need to wander in circles or spam the camp button to trigger monster respawns. There is always a new area at or slightly above a reasonable challenge level for the party, and hitting the level cap can be done just by completing most of the side content. And what content do Dungeons & Dragons fans usually want? Well, there are no dragons in Baldur's Gate, but there are certainly dungeons. The game's main plot featured several: 2 mine networks, the Candlekeep Crypts, and the Thieves' Maze. Prior to Tales of the Sword Coast, there were also a few side areas that might be regarded as dungeons, namely Firewine Bridge and the Ulcaster Ruins. By the standards of pen and paper role-playing, these probably aren't the most impressive specimens. Most featured traps and plenty of monsters, but puzzles, non-combat options, and other unconventional challenges were absent. Firewine, Ulcaster, and the Thieves' Maze are just labyrinths full of booby traps, although Firewine did feature a couple of alternative entrances. Tales of the Sword Coast changed this. The Ice Isle is barely worth mentioning, it's quite literally just a retextured copy-paste job of another dungeon. But Durlag's Tower has become a byword for classic dungeon design, at least to many people. According to Lucas Christiansen, Durlag's Tower was meant as a true pen and paper adventure in the style of classic D&D modules. Durlag's Tower is not just long, an exterior map, a few upper levels, and then the sprawling multi-level dungeons below, but also stuffed with unique combat encounters, puzzles, and small side quests. It's head and shoulders above anything in the original game, and I personally don't love it as much as other people. I like the atmosphere, some of the puzzles, a couple of the set-piece battles, and the background lore, but I find some of it a bit tedious, like the constantly respawning enemies, the lengthy slime tunnels filled with disease-ridden ghouls, and the odd undetectable, undisarmable traps that led to Durlag's Tower being dubbed the Tomb of Horrors of CRPGs. What's more, Durlag's Tower is to bad pathfinding what rotting cheese is to maggots. From Baldur's Gate to Icewind Dale 2, the Infinity Engine games are notorious for this. At best, this meant sighing every time party members took some ill-conceived alternate path. At worst, as seen in Durlag's Tower, it meant repeatedly wandering through death traps, getting stuck behind each other in corridors, and re-triggering an enemy spawn because they stumbled back through the fog of war on some pointless detour. And even with its improvements, Durlag's Tower is still a relatively pedestrian dungeon crawl. It is a crawl in all senses of the word. Cut down some monsters, die to a fireball, reload, shuffle forward a few pixels, and repeat. Outside of puzzles, NPC interaction is just for flavor and isn't particularly consequential. Secret corridors and hidden entrances don't really matter because you're not trying to avoid specific enemies or create shortcuts.
I gotta get out of here. Gotta get out!
I finally played through Dragon's Dogma a couple of years ago, and whilst the vanilla game bored me to tears, the Bitter Black Isle expansion really impressed me, in that it didn't feel so much like a video game dungeon as it did an ecosystem. It felt alive, with wandering monsters and multiple interconnected areas and ways to create shortcuts to the surface, because your party were adventurers on an expedition into the deadly uncharted depths. Not a SWAT team monotonously clearing a tenement building floor by floor. I guess to some extent that's the point of Durlag's Tower. It's something you endure, floor by torturous floor, until you're teleported back into the harsh sunlight. But for me, the narrative and emotional payoff for this drudgery was just not worth it. And that's fine, because though it's a D&D game, Baldur's Gate is not a dungeon crawler. The majority of the game is spread across open wilderness maps, and quest hubs like Beregost, Nashkel, and the Friendly Arm Inn, which are packed with explorable interiors and NPCs. A few of the quests you receive are localized, like defending a damsel in distress from thugs, but most have the party hiking across untamed heath and sward. The legacy of Baldur's Gate's development missteps is still evident in these areas. As though BioWare worked feverishly to fill these empty spaces with monsters, side quests, unique loot, and new NPC companions, their efforts were not enough for some critics. Even after replaying the game several times, I find that some of these outdoor areas are so forgettable that they blur together in the mind. Obviously, those with distinct landmarks and memorable content fare better. For example, the Lighthouse map includes a unique environmental feature. It's where you'll first run into sirens, meet the thief Safana, and find a pirate cave with a priceless stat-boosting magical tome. Similarly, Tales of the Sword Coast's other big addition, the Isle of Balduran, introduces unique new enemies, who bring to the forefront previously underutilized mechanics, like the importance of different damage types.
You're not figments, are you? I'm not wasting any more time talking to figments.
But a few of the vanilla game's other maps are just too similar, both in visual design and what they contain. There are just too many thinning woods that sprout the occasional pack of bandits or hobgoblins. Having a large, sparsely populated world is not always a bad thing. In the Fallout series, the act of traversing a blasted, empty wasteland in search of points of interest is itself part of the experience. This is why 10 years later, the same company that made Daggerfall would, ironically, be criticised for packing unique content too closely together, turning the wasteland into an amusement park. But the Sword Coast is not a post-nuclear wasteland, and though the Infinity Engine allows for some richly detailed environments, it's not immersive enough to make the act of merely walking around gazing at scenery a worthwhile activity in itself. Regardless of where the player's exploration leads, their path will eventually bring them to the game's namesake. The titular city of Baldur's Gate is closed to the player for about 60% of the main quest line, and if they spent a lot of time doing optional side content before getting to that point, then they won't actually step foot in the city until perhaps 80% of the way through the entire game. Baldur's Gate is, technically speaking, just another quest hub, but it's 9 or 10 times the size of Beregost, which is the second largest settlement in the game. Each of the city's 10 districts include a number of explorable interiors, mostly small dwellings, but also a few larger structures like inns, museums, and a mage tower. Beneath the city runs a large sewer network, which is sometimes used for fetch quests, and sometimes necessary to access certain buildings, but can also be used to avoid patrols of the city's Flaming Fist mercenary army. There's no doubt that there's plenty to do in Baldur's Gate, but there's a danger of the player already feeling a little burned out by the time they reach it. If you've been doing a fair bit of side content, there won't be any surprises in Baldur's Gate. For the most part, it's full of the same enemies and activities you've already encountered getting to this point. There are flashes of less conventional gameplay, like a heist quest for the local Thieves Guild, or looking into a local mercantile concern. The latter is interesting from a gameplay perspective. It creates the illusion of a non-linear investigation into various suspects, gathering evidence and trying to elicit information from NPCs whose loyalties are unclear, when previously quests would typically just make you go from point A to point B and then back. In reality, it's just window dressing, but it's a rare example of the game prodding the player to think for themselves. CRPGs have traditionally not been too good at imitating this aspect of tabletop gameplay, being limited by having to program a finite number of options where a dungeon master could think for themselves and adapt to the player's unexpected actions. There are actually so few examples of this in Baldur's Gate that they can be counted on one hand. One such quest is deceptively simple in its setup. Wander into one of the homes, and two young girls will claim they're being stalked by a boogeyman. Two suspects appear, and neither presents an entirely compelling case for the other's guilt. There's not really much more you can do other than roll the dice and hope you made the correct choice. Except, this is a high fantasy game, and several character classes have access to spells that let them discern an NPC's alignment. So, cast a Detect Evil spell and voila! It's not that this is necessarily a great quest, it's just one of the few instances in which players can think independently, rather than the game leading them around by the nose. But this philosophy is certainly not a guiding principle of the game's quest design. There are instances in which a charm spell can be used to obtain information, for example, but there's very little point to doing so. Take the following situation. One character has information the players need to progress the main quest. Inventive players might think to cast a charm spell, but the target will give out almost the exact same information if beaten into submission, and will even drop a scroll with this information if pickpocketed or accidentally killed. So there are several ways to get the same information, but there's no real incentive to pick anything but the path of least resistance. Any party is going to be strong enough to simply threaten or kill the target. The innkeep and local guards don't care about you assassinating people in their rooms. There are few innocent bystanders at risk from a confrontation, and the individual in question is not someone most characters would have any qualms about killing. One or two reviewers did criticise Baldur's Gate for this at the time, especially in the context of the then recently released Fallout 2, but judging from later BioWare titles, true mechanical reactivity in quest design has never been something they were especially concerned about. The reactivity that BioWare claimed was a pillar of their design philosophy only really counted for role-playing and narrative choices. Now, one of those pillars Ray Musaka cited as central to Baldur's Gate was its companions. In single-player mode, there are 25 potential party members dotted around the map, and most of whom were based on characters from P&P sessions BioWare's staff had played in their younger days. Musaka referenced the colourful personalities of Jagged Alliance and RTS games as inspirations, remarking on how impressed he was when he first selected a unit in Warcraft 2 and heard them bark out a memorable one-liner.
Your command, yes, my lord.
Baldur's Gate's companions have two main roles, in gameplay and in role-playing. We'll talk about the latter in the story and role-playing section of the video, but there is some crossover between these two roles. In a sense, party members in Baldur's Gate are themselves a kind of resource that needs to be properly managed. Since the game is balanced around having a diverse party, it's in the player's interest to fill their party roster with classes that fulfill specific roles. For example, the first potential companion is Imoen, a thief, a vital role in any party. A few minutes later, the player will probably encounter Monteron and Zar, a fighter thief and a mage, respectively. And if following the story, 30 minutes later they'll likely have Khalid and Jahira, a fighter and fighter druid at their side. But your companions aren't just loyal foot soldiers who'll jump to your every command. A few have very specific goals they'll expect you to help them accomplish, like visiting a specific area or finding another NPC. But all of them will follow the dictates of their moral and spiritual alignment.
It seems that this party isn't as pathetic as I first suspected.
Characters of any alignment will begin to complain when the party's reputation starts to drift too far from their own. So, for example, an evil character will be displeased if the companions become noted for their charity and benevolence.
Do-gooders always make me wanna vomit.
For explicitly good or evil characters, this divergence in values can become unbearable, leading them to quit the group for good, perhaps taking another party member with them if they're paired up. In extreme cases, they may even turn on the player and become hostile. A similar principle can also apply to companions' relationships with each other, as certain combinations of party members will lead to contention or even bloodshed, with the survivors returning to the player's control shortly afterwards. So, whilst there's a certain amount of entertainment value in running parties of mismatched values and personalities, in the long run the game strongly encourages matching party members to the player's own alignment, as losing a party member is a big deal. But obviously it's not just soap opera drama that can cost you a valued companion. As mentioned earlier, there are two types of death in Baldur's Gate. Regular garden variety death that can be reversed by priests, and total annihilation, which occurs when the player character dies, when jibbed by a critical hit, or when the body is destroyed by certain types of elemental damage. Permanent death can be used strategically by players who want to hang on to a party member but don't want their companion along for the ride. But it's also an ever-present danger in the course of normal adventuring, particularly at lower levels. When this happens, you can either reload, or cut your losses and power ahead. I imagine some first-time players, including myself back in 1998, didn't realise that there was no way to regain companions lost in this way, and found themselves in the unenviable position of being a critical party member short. So BioWare made an effort to try and include at least one or two companions per class of the same alignment as the player. The entire reason for Imowen's existence is that very late in development BioWare realised there were no early game thief companions for good players. So they simply repurposed a cut character, a guard called Pike, dragged artist Dean Anderson's wife into the photo booth, and presto, Imowen was born. This is also why potential companions are strung out across the length and breadth of the Sword Coast, sometimes even locked behind main quest progression. This is beneficial to new players who don't know where to go to find the exact class and alignment combination needed for an open slot, but it inevitably meant that certain party combinations became significantly more popular than others. Early game companions like Imowen, Khalid, Minsk, Dynahair, and Jaheira were a common sight, whereas NPCs locked behind later chapters, like Eldoth or Alora, tended to be less popular. Having 25 unique companions was impressive, but due to the way the game's alignment mechanics and pacing worked, I think most veteran players stick to very similar party compositions, unless they're deliberately forcing themselves to accept permadeaths, or just role-playing. Obviously, there are other factors at play in choosing who you want as your party companions, like preferring a specific character's personality, but we'll come back to that later in the video. So how well did Baldur's Gate adhere to those four principles of exploration, tactical combat, reactivity, and progression? I think that 3 of these were met, perhaps not with flying colours, but to some extent you can blame some of the game's shortcomings here on its desire to pay tribute to Dungeons & Dragons. There are mechanics in Baldur's Gate that are simply there because, well, they had to be there. The way armor class works, the spell balance, or lack thereof, the fact that drinking in a tavern is an actual mechanic in the game, albeit a virtually useless one. But I think some of these mechanics, like the much maligned melee combat, ended up working well as part of a whole, intentionally or not. Things that might seem unnecessary or trivial, like fatigue, the limited item stacking, and the harsh penalties for wounding and death, helped create the sense of the party being novice adventurers, encountering obstacles both monstrous and mundane. This also helps contribute to the party's sense of progression, scavenging for iron and finding their first magical weapon at the start of the game, slinging fireballs and calling down lightning by its end. I think its least impressive legacy is in reactivity. Putting aside story and role-playing options, Baldur's Gate's mechanical reactivity is found almost exclusively in its reputation and alignment systems, and it's a fairly general sort of reactivity at that, since the game rarely revisits specific quest outcomes. More to the point, the player's options for interacting with these quests are usually limited, often boiling down to fetch quests that might give you a couple of different dialogue choices. Quests that acknowledge thinking outside the box or acting on your own initiative are rarer than Tarrasques. But that's not to say the game is merely the sum of its parts. Even in quest design and reactivity, in the context of its contemporaries, Baldur's Gate only looks weak in comparison to the absolute gold standard of titles like Fallout and its sequel. It is disappointing that Baldur's Gate didn't innovate in these areas and arguably contributed to their sidelining, leaving later developers to try and advance them, but they're still good enough to keep the overall structure steady. In excelling in 3 areas and being at least okay in the 4th, Baldur's Gate is still a fantastic game.
Good day, my
Fine day to you, sire. Such a fine gentleman, wouldn't you say?
Most of the assets you'll see in Baldur's Gate went through 3 stages of development. A concept sketch, a 3D model, and finally the 2D sprite you see in-game. Not everything went through this lengthy process. Trent Oster likes to relate the story of using stock photos of coffee beans for cobblestone paths. But much of the game's world was done according to the former method, concepted by lead artist John Gallagher, who drew thousands of sketches of props, buildings, and NPCs. There's an interesting look to the character art that makes me think of a cross between old-school D&D and comic books, so it's only natural Gallagher collaborated with James Olin and Lucas Christiansen to create a tie-in comic entitled Tales of Baldur's Gate. Gallagher and the rest of the team were inspired by a variety of sources outside of Dungeons & Dragons. The game's central antagonist, for example, was, in Gallagher's own words, a rip-off of the Kurgan from Highlander. Of course, the concept artist's vision is still a long way from the final product. After conceptualization, the next stage was to turn Gallagher's sketches into a working 3D model, and finally converting various animations of this 3D model into 2D sprites to be inserted into the game. The benefit of using 2D sprites was that the original, highly detailed 3D models could be displayed on hardware that couldn't otherwise render these assets in real time. The pre-rendered background art, for example, consists of 10,000 unique images sewn together by the Infinity Engine. There was absolutely no way machines in 1998 could render such detailed 3D environments, and character models would surely have been much more simplistic and exaggerated in 3D. That doesn't mean it was as simple as creating the 3D models and then snapping the right frames. Trent Oster and Cameron Topher noted how difficult it was to make male and female models that looked both realistic and distinct from each other from a zoomed-out isometric perspective. Modelling lead Cassidy Scott would go through cycles of stretching and shrinking various body parts until they looked right at a 45-degree camera angle. Some people prefer the look of quote-unquote real 2D sprite work, as opposed to art based on 3D models, but if you zoom out or play Baldur's Gate on a CRT monitor, the graphics are so convincing you almost feel like you're watching one of those mid-90s CGI cutscenes. Another benefit to starting with 3D models, of course, is that you can go back and reuse or touch up these assets 10 or 20 years down the line. At least you would, if BioWare hadn't lost them all. Although the game's environments caught flack for being too mundane and samey, especially outdoors, I think they're very fitting for Baldur's Gate. Maybe it depends on where you grew up and what era of fantasy you lived through, but for me, Baldur's Gate epitomizes that relatable high fantasy world. Woods and forests are just woods and forests. They're not magical elf tree towns or wacky colour-coded elemental planes. You'll find crumbled towers and overgrown ruins here and there, but the Sword Coast is really just a regular old wilderness. Civilization follows a similarly down-to-earth philosophy. Squat keeps and Tudor manor houses are the order of the day, with rustic interiors warmed by cosy hearth fires. Even the more opulent locales seem fairly restrained, more appropriate to a successful merchant than an aristocrat's palatial abode. You might even say the Sword Coast looks a bit too welcoming, less fantasy Wild West and more visiting your grandparents in the country. I don't mean to imply Baldur's Gate looks more realistic or historical than other fantasy RPGs. It's relatable and authentic in the same sense as Xena Warrior Princess or Kevin Sorbo's Hercules. I suppose the term verisimilitude would crop up here, but I think grounded or earthy best describes the look of Baldur's Gate. I really disliked the art in James Olden's Heroes of Baldur's Gate because, whilst on a technical level it's very good, I think it goes too far in trying to make the original characters too exotic or visually distinct. They seem more like superheroes than sellswords and adventurers. Compare that to the game, where, for example, the Oriental Ogre Magi are an appropriately rare encounter, whereas the Hobgoblins, inspired by migrating steppe peoples, seem like a mundane, ever-present threat to frontier life. You could easily mistake Beregost or the Nashkel Carnival for a hobbyist's Renaissance fair. This extends to much of the costume and armour designs. I really love the sprites for the unarmoured human fighters, who absolutely nail the look of the traditional sword and sorcery protagonists. And the townsfolk look so perfectly generic. I could so easily see the stooped beggars or stout innkeepers in an old fantasy movie. It also helps that town life adheres to the day and night cycle, so during the day you'll see townsfolk out and about and merchants peddling their wares, but once night falls, honest folk retire to bed and less salubrious fauna wander the streets.
I'm a fine-looking strumpet, ain't I?
The downside to believable environments is that they can be quite boring. The Nashkel mines are particularly bad, full of winding, identical tunnels that often lead nowhere. Cloakwood is a little better, as it feels more like a legitimate living space for the mercenaries based there. I'm actually a bit unclear what they were going for with some of the dungeon designs. I understand the maze in the Thieves Guild is meant to be illogical and labyrinthian, even if it is both boring and frustrating to navigate, but I didn't appreciate Ulcaster and Firewine being laid out in a similar way. Durlag's Tower is naturally the standout, with only a couple of areas feeling repetitive or out of place, and the rest being both interesting and congruous to the setting. The visual effects in Baldur's Gate might not be as technically advanced as those seen in later Infinity Engine games, but again I think they fit the overall style of the game. The puff of conjurer's smoke when summoning monsters seems truer to low-level magic than interdimensional gates. whilst the web and entanglement effects look more like they belong in that world than the very showy versions in Icewind Dale. I suppose in a way it's sort of like the difference between practical and digital effects in movies. The latter might look better, but the former seem more corporeal. The most memorable effects are the fireballs and lightning bolts, the former reminiscent of a Moab, and the latter looking like it could smash through walls. I'm not so impressed by the water effects, which look too static and placid no matter which map you're on, and aside from fireplaces, you don't see a whole lot of motion in the backgrounds. It would have been nice to have some little touches like more props being animated during storms or snowfall. Speaking of things in motion, the game's highest quality assets were utilised for its FMV cutscenes, which featured heavily in early marketing and usually play upon reaching important story locations. One of the most dynamic of these is the opening cutscene, which is odd since, from what I've gathered, it was the very first cutscene created for the game in late 1996 or early 97. Many of the others are less impressive, usually just fly-throughs of empty, lifeless environments. These did not impress contemporary critics, who compared them unfavourably to Final Fantasy VII. One rare aspect that wasn't created from 3D assets are the parchment loading screens. It's easy to miss these today, since loading screens typically take a couple of seconds. They usually depict a typical adventuring party out on a stroll, but during certain quests and cutscenes, they'll show a scene related to the action. I don't know if these were made early in development or they're deliberately interpretive, as they don't always match the actual content that follows. The last major element of the visual design is obviously Baldur's Gate's UI and portrait art. Much of the hand-drawn art on that stone interface was done by Daniel Walker, who sadly passed away only a few months after Tales of the Sword Coast shipped. Artist Mike Sass is usually cited as being responsible for the portraits, though I've read articles that attribute them to other members of the development team. Some of the confusion probably stems from the fact that most of these portraits are touched-up versions of BioWare staff in cosplay. For example, Ajantis is Ray Muzaka, Karan is Greg Zeschuk, Garrick is Cameron Topher, and so on. I think the photorealistic element gives the portraits an air of believability without straying too far into office costume party territory, and they nicely complement the character sprites in communicating each character's personality. But it always bothered me that, for the purposes of role-playing, the level of detail in these portraits made it difficult to fall back on the player's imagination. What I mean by this is that in an Infinity Engine game, the portraits are so important to the player's image of a character that you need something that matches your vision as closely as possible. You can't just have a heavily pixelated image and say, meh, good enough. Finding the exact match for the player character can be quite difficult, especially if you didn't want to use a portrait already assigned to a companion. This became less of an issue after release, of course, since custom portraits quickly flooded fan sites. Besides, a big part of these characters' personalities is communicated through their voice acting.
You're so dull.
This is an area in which the game's publisher did take a much bigger role. Much of the voice talent used in games like Dragon Age and Mass Effect originally came to BioWare's attention via Interplay. Considering the game's budget, Baldur's Gate was lucky to be blessed with an abundance of experienced actors. Many companions and NPCs are brought to life by prolific VAs like Jim Cummings.
If I continue with this, I'll never look Boo in the eyes again. Choose carefully. I'll not let this come to pass.
Frank Welker.
Smiles, everyone! Smiles!
This is like some great fantasy.
Jim Meskimen.
Please, Jahira, you needn't be so... Oh.
And Kevin Michael Richardson.
You know why I'm here. Hand over your ward and no one will be hurt. If you resist, it shall be a waste of your life.
The game also featured Hollywood stars like Earl Bone, and familiar faces from later BioWare titles like Jennifer Hale and Grey Delisle. Most of the voiced lines in Baldur's Gate are very brief, used for greetings, combat barks, and companion comments.
I've just about seen enough waking hour, slave driver.
Some of the main quest NPCs are partially voiced, but the only time the player will hear lengthy monologues is during the game's dream sequences and chapter transitions.
Over the walls there is a candle in your old room, but as the light goes out, the bricks surrounding the window closes together.
There are also a few cases of party members engaging in friendly banter or brief arguments.
Perhaps we could talk over wine tonight. I've never met a lady such as you, and I'm desirous to know you better.
I am flattered. Thank you.
Like the companions themselves, the voice acting is deliberately exaggerated to make the characters seem larger than life, which I think is usually fine considering they're just one-liners. That said, there are one or two grating lines, like characters spitting cultural references.
I am become death, destroyer of worlds!
And some badly mixed audio.
Seems to me like these men want a little trouble. I'll give them trouble.
Overall though, I think the NPC's voice packs are very good, and I wish it were possible to make use of them as the player without resorting to modding. The overall sound design is one of my favourite things about Baldur's Gate. You can hear the whoosh of every mist swing, the twang of bowstrings, the meaty pop of a critical jibbing. Almost every spell has a distinct and recognisable aural profile, and veterans will likely never forget the sound of a magic missile being fired. If you're playing the game for the first time, it won't be long before you learn to dread this sound.
I don't feel too good.
Ambient sound is pretty good as well. You can hear howling winds and crashing waves in some areas, although there are definitely areas that could have used more sources of environmental noise. This isn't too big a problem in settlements, as the random comments from NPCs help fill in the gaps, but some of the wilderness areas can be a bit too quiet. It's also worth mentioning that most players won't be able to enjoy Baldur's Gate's EAX environmental effects, which require a compatible sound card and legacy software like Creative Labs' Alchemy to get working. The reason certain areas are a bit lacking in the sound department is, of course, that music is meant to pick up the slack. The soundtrack to Baldur's Gate was composed by Michael Hoenig, who worked on many notable TV shows and movies of the 1990s. Hoenig had an interesting career arc, becoming involved in the progressive rock and electronic music scene in the early 70s, joining Tangerine Dream for a short period, and eventually ending up on more mainstream projects. I recommend checking out some of his solo work, especially the 1978 album Departure from the Northern Wasteland. Hoenig's work on Baldur's Gate is usually bombastic and exhilarating, evoking armies of Teutonic knights and the clash of titans, but it also has some pleasant and homely tracks like the Beregost theme, plus the eerie and contemplative dream music. And if you've played Interplay's Descent to Undermountain, keep your ears open for a particular track. Now, some fans have raised concerns about the originality of some of Hoenig's work on Baldur's Gate, particularly Attacked by Assassins, which bears a strong similarity to the main theme of the 1984 movie Life Force. I didn't look too deeply into this, as frankly I don't care. Some themes from movie and TV are actually constructed from the same audio sampling libraries, and in some cases music is licensed out for reuse with minor modifications. You might be aware that composer Mark Morgan's work on Fallout came under scrutiny for its similarity to Aphex Twin, Brian Eno, and W.G. Walden, and Morgan later explained that he was sent a CD of random tracks by Interplay and asked to create something from it, without knowing the source of these tracks. Perhaps Hoenig was in a similar situation, or maybe he had some involvement with Life Force's music due to his previous relationship with the producers. To my knowledge, Hoenig has never commented on his work on Baldur's Gate, and Beamdog were unable to contact him during the development of Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition. On the subject of the Enhanced Edition, it's natural for new players to ask which version of Baldur's Gate they should be playing. This is a tough question. In my opinion, the best option is an old retail copy, or Baldur's Gate the original saga on GOG. These would be the most authentic versions of Baldur's Gate, but they do have a few issues. If you have an old retail copy, you need to be careful where you install it, due to that wretched user account control used by modern Windows. Another common complaint is that even the GOG release has issues with slowdown and visual glitches. There are various ways to tackle this. There are a number of configurable wrappers that emulate direct draw in Windows 10, like DG Voodoo and DXWind, but in my experience the fastest and simplest method is to install Acrit's mod and experiment with the options. There might be some minor graphical anomalies left over, but the most serious artifact you want to avoid is the flickering cursor. If you can get rid of that, there shouldn't be any other major issues. So if you can get up to this point, you're good to go. The second option for playing Baldur's Gate is through one of the mega mods porting the game to the Baldur's Gate 2 engine, such as Baldur's Gate Trilogy or BG22. The installation process for these mods might seem daunting, but so long as you follow the instructions carefully, you shouldn't have any problems. The reason I bring these mods up here rather than the modding section is that the BG2 engine, which uses the OpenGL renderer, has far better general compatibility with modern systems, so if you really can't get BG1 working, this is a fair compromise. Unfortunately, no matter whether you play the original game or one of these mods, there's not much you can do about the aspect ratio. There are widescreen mods, but I personally don't like the look of these. I think they zoom the game out way too far. For true widescreen compatibility, you'll have to turn to the final option, which is the Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition. Now, explaining why I don't recommend the Enhanced Editions of any Infinity Engine title is a whole video in itself, but to summarise, like the Baldur's Gate Trilogy or BG2 mods, the Enhanced Edition significantly changes the underlying mechanics of Baldur's Gate to bring it in line with the system used in Baldur's Gate 2. This means you're just not playing the game as it was intended. Also, Dragon Age style companions like Nira and Dornil Khan were added to the game, replete with their own cutscenes, romances and personal quests, all of which are very different to content in the base game. Furthermore, the original game's art style was overhauled. Some of the original assets were replaced by those from BG2, Icewind Dale, and the modding community. Most cutscenes were removed or replaced, whilst the pre-rendered backgrounds and in-game sprites were changed to fit Beamdog's artistic vision. Further changes were made leading up to the release of the Siege of Dragonspear expansion, reworking the rendering engine and overhauling the user interface once again. I'd also point out that I played through the Enhanced Edition in 2020, and despite focusing almost exclusively on the main quest, I encountered numerous reproducible game-stopping bugs. That's 8 years after this version's original release. Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition is a great game, but it's by no means a straight upgrade of the original, let alone a definitive version of Baldur's Gate. Unless you're a console or mobile gamer, or you just can't get the original game working, I have to recommend first-time players give the Enhanced Edition a pass. Unfortunately, Beamdog, or another party, depending on who you believe, made the controversial decision to have the original games removed from digital storefronts, so new digital copies of the original Baldur's Gate must now be purchased as part of the more expensive enhanced editions. Before we move on, it's worth mentioning that there are a couple of other unofficial versions of Baldur's Gate floating around. The first is the unfinished PSX port. The task of cramming Baldur's Gate onto the original PlayStation was given to British developer Runecraft sometime in 1998 or 1999. However, when publisher Interplay's financial troubles came to a head and they were bought out by Titus Interactive, Baldur's Gate's console ports were soon on the chopping block. It's not hard to see why. A build of the game was acquired by a private collector and found its way online many years later. As hideous and unwieldy as this port is, it's technically playable and has some cool little stylistic touches, like unique visuals and its own soundtrack. It takes about 2 hours and numerous crashes just to get to Beregost, but the game is supposedly possible to complete in its entirety. You can try running this via emulation if you're curious, though obviously I don't endorse the unauthorized sharing of software. The other version worth mentioning is Baldur's Gate Reloaded, a fan remake of Baldur's Gate using the Neverwinter Nights 2 toolset that was released in 2013. I haven't played it myself because A, this video is already too long, B, I don't like Neverwinter Nights 2, and C, the same team is working on a remake of the sequel in the same engine, and have stated they intend to overhaul the original Baldur's Gate Reloaded at some point in the future. I guess it could be interesting to compare this version of the game with the original in a future video, but no promises.
With our iron shortage, how are we to defend ourselves? What of the Zentarum? I've heard that they may be somehow involved.
If it isn't obvious to the rest of you, it's obvious to me. Wants a war!
Baldur's Gate takes place in Ed Greenwood's Forgotten Realms campaign setting, which was originally released as an AD&D sourcebook in 1987, and is today one of the most popular and recognisable universes associated with the Dungeons & Dragons franchise. The focus of Forgotten Realms adventures is the continent of Faerun, which is vaguely inspired by the European late Middle Ages, with the usual jumble of classic fantasy races added to the mix. Baldur's Gate focuses upon a stretch of land called the Sword Coast. The Sword Coast is an untamed frontier region, supposedly taking its name from the beasts and brigands that menace this wild stretch of coastland. Here and there lie the legacy of the frontiersmen: burned out homesteads, abandoned villages, and overgrown forts. Despite its dangers, a few shrewd, hardy, and well-financed communities have managed to prosper. Chief among these is the port city of Baldur's Gate, founded by the good-natured pirate and conquistador Balduran, with loot from far-off lands. The city is a hub for merchants, mercenaries, and mariners, welcoming anyone with the grit and gold to make a name for themselves. 4 Grand Dukes control the city, ruling through the Flaming Fist, a well-funded, well-equipped mercenary company that extends the city's grip far beyond its walls. To the south, the town of Beregost also serves as a beacon of civilized life, thanks to generous investment from mercantile concerns and the military support of Baldur's Gate. The presence of the Flaming Fist deters bandits and monsters, and ensures Beregost stays independent of Arm, a rival plutocracy with designs on the region. A few other communities have also carved out a space for themselves, like the fortified Friendly Arm Inn, the halfling hamlet of Gullykin, and the library fortress of Candlekeep, the greatest repository of knowledge in the realms. Candlekeep is where players begin their journey. The player-made protagonist is an orphan with no knowledge of their heritage, growing up behind the fortress walls alongside their childhood friend Imoen. They are wards to the mage Gorion, who serves as their foster father and, depending on the player's chosen class, also their tutor. Sequestered from the outside world for much of their life, the player is suddenly introduced to the harsh reality of the Sword Coast when they are targeted by footpads, and Gorion informs them that they must depart their childhood home as soon as possible. In the midst of their flight, Gorion and his ward are intercepted by a dark knight and his underlings, and the player is left alone in the world. Imoen, who has snuck out of Candlekeep of her own accord, catches up to the player, and the two set out in search of new meaning and direction in their lives. As the player explores the Sword Coast, they find that the region is gripped by fresh terror and lawlessness. The roads are choked with dead travellers and looted caravans, victims of bandits who prey on iron rather than gold. The local iron mines of Cloakwood are seemingly abandoned, whilst iron coming from the Amnian mines of Nashkel is warped and weakened. The road to Baldur's Gate is cut off, and the people, starving, penniless and scared, whisper that this is some elaborate plot on the part of Arm's greedy merchant lords. Flaming Fist mercenaries stalk the wilderness in search of brigands and Amnian spies, and Arm's soldiers begin to flood Nashkel in response to the instability, further fanning fears of an invasion. The hero and their companions soon discover that there is another group behind the chaos, hoping to profit from war between Baldur's Gate and Arm, and this group do not appreciate the party's meddling. But unknown even to these conspirators is another player, who sees not monetary gain in the war, but the fulfillment of a dark plan that began many years earlier, when a bloody-handed god walked the earth. Baldur's Gate mined the lore of the Forgotten Realms with just as much enthusiasm as you'd expect from a bunch of D&D nerds making their first RPG. The religions of Faerun are well represented, with temples to mercantile deities and Umberlee, the bitch queen of the sea, particularly popular along the coastway for obvious reasons. Famous characters from the tabletop books will also pop up, such as Elminster, Ed Greenwood's self-insert fantasy, the chronicler Volo Gedenthorpe, the monk Cadley, and Driz Do'Urden, the bête noire of jaded dungeon masters. Many of the major organisations operating on Faerun also have a presence in Baldur's Gate, with agents of the Goodly Harpers, cutthroat Zentarim Syndicate, and magicratic Thyans seeking to use the chaos for their own ends. Despite all these wild and wonderful powers and personages, the backdrop to Baldur's Gate is a fairly prosaic fantasy setting. Rather than alighting flying cities or storming the Nine Hells, players will be hiking through woods and hitting up local taverns. The Sword Coast is a dangerous and unpredictable place, but it's also something of a backwater. The average person is more concerned with their plough breaking or cows being attacked than witches and warlocks and ancient rituals. Demographically, the story is the same. Most Balduranians are human, with a fair number of halflings and half-elves in the mix. Pure-blooded elves are rare, though a few dwarves and gnomes ply their trade as merchants and mercenaries. The local threats are mostly pests like gibberlings and kobolds. Don't expect to battle vampires or liches in Baldur's Gate. They have far more important places to be. The provincialism of the setting is reflected in the writing and dialogue. Many NPCs speak in a sort of faux regional dialect, a mix of fantasy ye olde English and modern North American slang. The player themselves can sometimes adopt this mode of speaking too, although the dialogue options are quite inconsistent about this. Much of the main plot is in line with this tone. The game is surprisingly comprehensive in relating the thrilling conspiracy behind the Iron Crisis, explaining how trade routes, political treaties, mining contracts, and price fixing are being manipulated by the antagonists to engineer government no-bid contracts. Until this video, I'd completely forgotten the specifics of the villainous plot to bypass Balduranian multi-sourcing regulations.
I love money. Yes, I do.
A little dry for a fantasy adventure, some might argue. It's not surprising BioWare never really went into this level of detail in future tales. Why write about hostile takeovers when there are stories of dragon slaying and exotic romances to be told? But it all feeds into making the world feel like credible set dressing. From the very day in 1997 that BioWare set up forums for fans to discuss the upcoming game, people asked whether they would be able to play as drow or half-orcs or ninjas or all manner of other unique species and professions. Would players trek to the deserts of Anaroch or the halls of the Hal Ruins? At the time, the answer was no. Baldur's Gate was to be a grounded, low-level AD&D adventure. But 20 years later, Dungeons & Dragons has changed. Baldur's Gate 3 opens with a draconic dogfight, and the hero battling free from a crashed spaceship. Your protagonist can be a demon or a drow, and live out Tumblr fanfiction fantasies via vampire sex romps and Githyanki BDSM sessions. This isn't a good or bad thing. It's just a totally different experience to that offered by Baldur's Gate. Gary Gygax once argued that fantasy is unquestionably humanocentric, with demi-humans, semi-humans, and humanoids in various orbits around the sun of humanity. And Gygax argued that it should remain so, for all players are after all human. It is enough fantasy to assume a swords and sorcery cosmos, with impossible professions and make-believe magic. To adventure among the weird is fantasy enough, without becoming that too. No matter which race you roll for Baldur's Gate, it is a story about humans. About human laws, human commerce, human geopolitical concerns. It is a story that features non-humans, but these exist in the context of human societies and human belief systems. The most outlandish elements of Baldur's Gate are outlandish because they exist in such a grounded and relatable medieval fantasy. But like I said earlier in the video, grounded and relatable is a very subjective phrase when it comes to fantasy. True, most of Baldur's Gate is spent dealing with very material stories, but we have to remember that there are two major plot threads running through Baldur's Gate: the Iron Crisis conspiracy and the more fantastical one. This second thread was to become central to the Baldur's Gate series. Certainly more than Baldur's Gate itself, the title more assails and contractual connivance for future entries. The game opens with that horribly overused Nietzsche quote about men becoming monsters, and hints at some sort of Highlander-esque scenario in which an armoured figure is hunting down and killing individuals with some sort of unspecified kinship. The player character, Gorian's ward, briefly encounters this armoured figure at the start of their journey, but doesn't actually see them again until much later on, instead running into various flunkies hoping to cut their journey short. The player's party as a whole is often targeted by assassins seeking to prevent their interference in the Iron Conspiracy, but Gorian's ward had a bounty on their head long before they set foot in the Nashkel mines. Somebody sees their mere existence as a threat. This is connected to the player being visited by disturbing dreams that hint at some dark legacy and a dormant evil that is slowly trying to influence their decisions. Fortune tellers and oracles flee or attack the player like cornered beasts. The protagonist's feelings on the matter are determined by their reputation, with individuals the game judges to be of an unpleasant mien, seeing this darkness as a power to be usurped rather than resisted. All these little touches tease a revelation that doesn't bear fruit until many, many hours into Baldur's Gate. It's easy to forget that the game's 6th chapter was meant to be a huge narrative gut punch, teased by the cryptic comments and Delphic nightmares of those earlier chapters, until the truth finally comes crashing down around 3/4 into the story. What with the internet, the series' popularity, and the simple fact that future installments were openly predicated on this revelation, it's difficult for new players to enjoy this aspect of the storytelling today. Now, a spoiled plot twist is something you can't really get back, but there are elements around this that could have been handled more effectively and made Chapter 6 much more compelling. Let's take a look at what happens in Chapter 6. It's here the player pursues the architects of the Iron Shortage back to the beginning of their journey, the library fortress of Candlekeep. This chapter is intersected by a side plot that is important to both major plot lines, that side plot being the Doppelganger conspiracy. Players first encountered doppelgangers in Chapter 5. Baldur's Gate's moneyed elite were on edge, confiding that friends and acquaintances had been acting strangely, making nonsensical business decisions and neglecting prior relationships in favour of surreptitious nighttime gatherings. Earlier in the video I mentioned that there are 1 or 2 quests that tease the gameplay implications of exposing doppelgangers, as players try to match wits rather than steal with their foes. But it's just a brief, suspenseful lull in the action before the curtain is lifted and the bloodshed resumes. The Doppelganger plotline continues into Chapter 6's return to Candlekeep, only this time, the faces these creatures wear are no longer those of strangers. I really liked the implications of doppelgangers, both in their sadly unrealised potential for quest design and as a form of psychological horror. Chapter 6 should have been a severe blow to the protagonist's psyche, with the double impact of the fantastical plot twist and their childhood being turned against them. You get the faintest taste of this in the Candlekeep catacombs, as comforting faces from your past emerge from the shadows to taunt and terrorise you. But it could have been so much more. Nosing around the environment, you'll find heaps of rotting corpses and crematoriums, begging the question, when did the doppelgangers begin to infiltrate Candlekeep, and who else is not who they say they are? Unfortunately, this is unrealised. The doppelgangers are slaves to their appetites. They'll make crude attempts to deceive you, but the slightest sign of skepticism will completely exhaust their patience and they'll leap to the attack. The disturbing potential of doppelganger infiltration is used too bluntly by the writers. The player's party have been tracked by plenty of assassins, so what was to stop doppelgangers from cloaking themselves in the skin of a potential ally, or replacing a companion during the night? James Olin did try to do something like this in the Heroes of Baldur's Gate module. Also, though the game is sometimes inconsistent about times and dates, one thing we know for sure is that the doppelganger conspiracy was not a long con. There's no indication that the doppelgangers had any influence on the player's formative years, and the player's interactions with NPCs during the prologue chapter don't gain any extra significance from the events of Chapter 6. The doppelganger conspiracy doesn't get the gravitas it deserves. Quite the opposite. In Chapter 6, the threat of the doppelgangers is completely deflated. They become nothing more than cardboard pop-ups in a haunted house, waving their claws and raving ineffectually before you knock them down again. The doppelgangers are no longer so terrible. They become victims of the player's power fantasy. Was this the right tone to take? Gary Gygax wrote that men are the worst monsters, but he meant in the sense of the game's mechanics, not in the philosophical sense that Baldur's Gate uses the concept. The idea behind Chapter 6, I suppose, is that the dark power within the protagonist is worse than any literal monster. But the player's actions do not actually support this idea. Most of what occurs in Chapter 6 is the player being subjected to the machinations of others and attempting to fight their way free. The most evil and depraved act a good or neutral player could conceivably perform in Chapter 6 is to goad the Architects of the Iron Crisis into battle. Even evil characters can't do much worse. Causing too much trouble in Candlekeep will result in a game over, and the nastiest thing they can do in the Catacombs is accidentally slay neutral NPCs. The player's heroic path through Chapter 6 to Chapter 7 and the game's finale is mostly linear and essentially identical between players of different alignments. At no point in the game does it actually back up the idea that the player's actions are being influenced by the monster within them. At no point in the main questline does a player need to reflect on their actions. Violence swirls around the player, but violence swirls around any adventuring party. The Sword Coast is a violent place. There is absolutely no pressure or compulsion to act more aggressively than any reasonable person in the same situation. If anyone in the party is unable to control their emotions, it's not the protagonist.
Better part of valor! Better part of valor!
So Baldur's Gate claims to be a story about men being monsters, but it doesn't follow through with this idea in any meaningful way. In reality, it's a very typical fantasy tale of men slaying monsters and saving the day. But the main plot is only a small part of the writing and world design in Baldur's Gate. Most of the time, the player will engage with Faerun and its inhabitants during side quests and general exploration. The tone of the writing here, which makes up the bulk of the game's content, is sometimes less serious than that of the main narrative. The single-player companions are a good illustration of this. With most being based on favourites from BioWare's P&P sessions, they run the gamut from original inventions with fleshed-out, compelling backstories, to pop culture tributes and willfully absurd one-note joke characters. So the character of Shartil is an obvious homage to the Red Sonja archetype and similar Amazonian warrior woman.
Don't think yourself second to any man.
Thank you. You're very kind.
Ajantis is a young paladin eager to prove his worth to the Order of the Radiant Heart, and uncompromising in his view of what is good and evil in the world.
Evil must be purged without mercy.
Tiax is a psychotically evil, megalomaniacal gnome who can be found ranting in the street and convinced to grace the party with his leadership.
The day comes when Tiax will point and click.
A lot of these characters originally had much more extensive backstories. Some of these can still be read on archives of the original Baldur's Gate site, but in other cases revisions were made because they wouldn't make sense in the final game. In the tabletop game, Minsk was actually the brother of the game's antagonist, for example. What remains of most of these characters might seem wanting by modern standards, limited to repetitive comments and a little bit of reactivity, but it's enough to give them a distinct personality. So some of these characters can seem rather one-dimensional or silly, but by the standards of pulp fantasy they're not too horrible, and players certainly took a liking to many of them.
Well, everyone is basically decent, once you get them to unwrinkle their faces.
Taking a broader view of the NPCs and writing in Baldur's Gate, we see a similar pattern. Most content is fine, but a few bad examples stick out. There's an attempt at giving the player room to bring some of their personality into dialogue responses, but these sometimes clash with the limited amount of options and force the player to respond with bizarre or out-of-character comments. Also, it doesn't seem like there was any oversight on the journal entries, which read like they were written by 3 or 4 different people. Chapter transitions are copied from the narrated dream sequences, whilst quest entries and random encounters of note are ostensibly penned by the player character, despite flipping from stenographer to humorist to snarky teenager at the drop of a hat. Trent Oster revisited these issues during the Siege of Dragonspear controversy, defending the quality and tone of writing in the enhanced editions in the context of, for example, various pop culture references in the original game. I don't want to get into the enhanced editions, but it's worth pointing out that such problems in the original game were mitigated by technical limitations. Characters like Lord Foreshadow, Bub Snikt, and Peter North are quite stupid and potentially distracting, but they're just a bunch of mushy pixels and a few lines of throwaway dialogue, not lengthy cutscenes or fully animated and voice-acted sequences that cost $50,000 worth of work that you are going to watch whether you like it or not. There's a good reason it's common for modern development studios to hire dedicated creative and technical staff to focus on cutscenes and story content. In that sense, Baldur's Gate was fortunate to be made in the late 90s, as both then and now it's easier to brush off bad writing. But most of the writing we've talked about so far has been writer-centric, with someone like Lucas Christiansen or James Olin ultimately in control of what happens to the player. But Baldur's Gate is an RPG, and though mechanical reactivity might not have been so important to BioWare, role-playing was. Gorion's ward may be driftwood floating down the stream of BioWare's old tabletop stories, but who that character is, and how they respond to the world around them, is up to the player. Now, almost everyone on the Sword Coast wants something of the protagonist. To slay beasts, spy on their foes, rescue their loved ones, or fetch their old boots. How the player interacts with these groups is partly based on their reputation, but their choice of companions will also factor into this, as a number of these party members have an agenda beyond straightforward greed or ties of friendship. We talked earlier about the fairly limited options players had for dealing with quest objectives, but BioWare did try to give them a lot of opportunities to decide the final outcome of these quests. Since the player is forced to assign a specific moral alignment to their character, they'll also be making decisions based on how they, or their character, would react to hard choices. Well, I say hard choices, but are they really? According to Chris Parker, Baldur's Gate had to operate under license holder TSR's Code of Ethics, which limited BioWare's options for acknowledging morally ambiguous actions. Quick history lesson for those who aren't familiar with this. Starting in the 1980s, Dungeons & Dragons was the subject of a moral panic in which the game was tied to the corruption and degeneration of young people. Politicians and media-friendly experts blamed tabletop gaming for ritual murders and Satanism. After the suicide of Irving Lee Pulling in 1982, his mother famously described Dungeons & Dragons as a fantasy role-playing game which uses demonology, witchcraft, murder, rape, blasphemy, suicide, assassination, insanity, sex perversion, homosexuality, prostitution, satanic-type rituals, gambling, barbarism, cannibalism, sadism, desecration, demon summoning, necromantics, divination, and other teachings. Whilst to the average teenager this was probably quite the endorsement, moral guardians were less impressed. Throughout the 80s and early 90s, publishers and retailers were threatened with legal, financial, and reputational consequences for associating with Dungeons & Dragons. TSR responded to this by attempting to sanitize many campaign settings, scrubbing overt references to the names, practices, and iconography of real-life religions, and discouraging its writers from delving into darker subject matter. Although by the late 90s, violent or sexually suggestive video games were the new target of activists, Baldur's Gate was still forced to avoid the appearance of rewarding evil behaviour. According to Parker, this meant that an evil character's role-playing options were mostly limited to being lazy, dishonest, or tight-fisted, and indeed, role-playing a particularly parsimonious character can result in the player being targeted by death squads. But I don't think BioWare can fob all the problems with the alignment system onto TSR. We talked about the relationship between the companion alignment system and reputation mechanics earlier on. For good party members, this is fairly logical. Being charitable and heroic will please your kind-hearted and noble companions.
We follow the righteous path, the path of hell.
Still, I do wish BioWare had done more to distinguish between actions that align with a lawful good character and those that match the values of a chaotic good individual, especially in the context of whether to follow the dictates of authority figures. One simple side quest involves a flaming fist mercenary hunting down a deserter. The wounded deserter can be found nearby, attended to by his lover. You can either drag him back to his former comrades, or deliver him halfway across the world to a safe haven. The latter is more time-consuming, but also features objectively better rewards. If you read all the dialogue associated with this quest, the deserter seems to have been motivated by lovesickness. So this seems like the kind of moral quandary that would challenge the player, and a lawful good party in particular, to think carefully about what they consider the good option. And that brings us back to that issue of party members' alignment, because it's where the system really starts to fall apart. One of the most well-known side quests in Baldur's Gate is the rescue of the Dark Elf Viconia, who is being chased by a mercenary intent on summary execution. Whether Viconia committed the crime she's accused of is never established, though it's revisited in Baldur's Gate 2 if the player pursues her romance. Cutting down the mercenary, which in the setting means murdering an officer of the law engaged in his duty, incurs no penalty, which is already odd. Letting Viconia join the party for protection does mean a reputational loss, and good aligned party members, lawful or chaotic, are not going to appreciate the nuance of the situation. But here's where we get to the best part. Viconia herself is an evil character, which means, despite the fact she wants to be left alone and protected from persecution, she adores parties that go around slaughtering townsfolk and racking up bounties. Conversely, she will be angered by the party gaining a positive reputation, and will quit the group in disgust if they become too friendly with the authorities.
I am disappointed by our lack of progress.
This is a common thread with evil-aligned companions. Most players will, in the course of their adventure, probably end up gaining positive reputation points. As Chris Parker admitted, the game encourages making good aligned decisions and rewards players for this in the long run, usually with more experience or extra quests, plus generally better prices and reactions from NPCs. This is already an issue without bringing companion alignment into the mix. An evil character has to actually go out of their way to be evil, and is punished severely for it. A lawful evil character in particular shouldn't want to bring down the wrath of the Flaming Fist just for the pleasure of being rude or making an extra 50 gold. I suppose this might be somewhat in line with a brutal, bullying, chaotic evil character, but there's no evil authority or power structure in the game to align oneself with, aside from an extremely brief stint in a bandit camp that characters of any alignment can pull off. Bring evil companions and the absurdities of the reputation system into the mix, and you have a situation in which evil characters are being arbitrarily evil, doing evil deeds because that's what evil people do.
What? You gonna wash your hands? No, 'cause I'm evil.
Sure, this was also a criticism of the alignment system in the tabletop game. It's not a setting like Planescape, wherein characters following arbitrary spiritual doctrine is kind of the point. But the way all this plays out from a gameplay and role-playing perspective means that an evil playthrough is essentially a novelty mode in Baldur's Gate. It's silly, illogical, and objectively more challenging than playing an insufferably noble character, or a lawful evil cuckoo who conceals themselves amongst do-gooders. The weakness of the alignment system is definitely something BioWare themselves struggled with, and re-examining the notion of reputation or alignment in RPGs was clearly something that motivated their work on future games.
went over it. And the interesting about Infinity Engine is so much of it is run by data. You can say, oh, every game is data. But anybody that knows anything about the Infinity Engine, there's a folder that's 2DAs, two-dimensional arrays. So they're just these, it's like a spreadsheet, that has all this data in it. And it was amazing how much of that game you can change, or game rules you can change just by changing those text files.
Although the Infinity Engine wasn't specifically built from the ground up to accommodate modding, BioWare did try to make it convenient for players to import their own custom portraits and character sound sets into the game. Soon after release, fan sites were flooded with character headshots from TV, movies, games, and iconic fantasy artists like Larry Elmore, Keith Parkinson, Brom, Boris Vallejo, Julie Bell, and many more. It's extremely easy to create custom portraits. Just modify your image so it meets the correct size and colour depth formats, and you're off. Character sound sets are a bit trickier to make yourself, but still doable. Unfortunately, a lot of the user-made Baldur's Gate 1 sound sets have been lost over the years, as fan sites died, file hosts purged old content, and modders abandoned early versions to concentrate on the Baldur's Gate 2 engine. But if you look hard enough, you can still find a few on sites like Sorcerer's Place. Now, prior to the development of tools such as Wesley Weimer's Waidu, making more substantive changes to the game, such as modifying the maps, was a real challenge, and it was only due to early efforts from its passionate fanbase that the original Baldur's Gate has a modding scene at all. There are several large mods available for the original Baldur's Gate, featuring new quests, maps, items, and NPCs. We'll take a look at the most notable of these. The most famous is undoubtedly the Dark Side of the Sword Coast mod. This was perhaps the first of the major quest mods, originally released in the year 2000 by Team BG. Darkside is sometimes dubbed an unofficial expansion to Baldur's Gate, sort of like a supercharged version of the Tales of the Sword Coast mission pack. The level cap is significantly increased, the spellbooks have been greatly expanded, many new items and gear have been added, and some areas and NPCs in the vanilla game have been overhauled. But the star attraction of Darkside would be its new quest lines, high-level adventures that take players through haunted woods, a vampire's citadel, and even the Underdark. These areas are extremely challenging, and are definitely designed for high-level parties who are extremely familiar with both the original game and the new spells added by the mod. One enemy, for example, is capable of level draining your party, not as a status effect like in Baldur's Gate 2, but the permanent removal of that character's experience points. So you should make sure you've got spellcasters to summon meat shields and a priest to cast negative plane protection. Unsurprisingly, several of the new companions added by the mod are extremely overpowered, with several innate abilities and gear that surpass anything found in the original game. I played the 1.04 version of this mod on the advice of others, and I wasn't too keen on it myself. Due to the mod originally being developed in the very early days of Baldur's Gate modding, the production values aren't that impressive. The new enemies are just recolored vanilla monsters, the new areas are all copies of existing maps, and the advanced scripts used by certain quests, set-piece battles, and custom party members have a tendency to glitch out or break the Baldur's Gate 1 engine. There's very little in the way of role-playing options in Darkside, and the endless hack and slash felt more like it belonged in the combat-centric Icewind Dale series. Whilst the team behind Darkside deserve massive credit for pushing the scene forward, I personally don't recommend the mod as a must-play addition. Keep in mind that you have to start an entirely new game after installing the mod, and it has a lot of compatibility issues with other user content. So it's not something you should install out of curiosity or as an addition to an ongoing playthrough. Another major quest mod is the Grey Clan Episode 1. This mod was originally meant to be part of a trilogy, but I believe it was abandoned during the development of Episode 2. Nevertheless, it's a generally polished high-level adventure in which the player joins an elite force of the Flaming Fist Mercenary Company to counter a new threat to the Sword Coast. The party will battle hardened criminals, rogue mages, dark priests, and Flaming Fist turncoats as they try to unravel the plans of the Grey Clan. The mod is much smaller than Darkside, with only a few copied and pasted areas from the original game, but it has a few side quests and can be very challenging. I was using the easier, light version of the mod, and enemies still packed a punch. In fact, one fight was impossible without massive cheesing due to the boss continually healing and rebuffing himself, to the point that I think it might have been a glitch. Although the mod isn't going to wow anyone, and again is mostly hack and slash, it's generally very polished, though obviously not written by a native English speaker, and it makes for a good, generally well-balanced challenge for an endgame party. Balance is probably not the word you'd associate with Dark Horizons, in which the player is targeted by assassins working for a mysterious organisation called Section. Though the main quest is relatively short, it does also add some minor side quests and overhauls parts of the original game. Dark Horizons is a bit notorious for showering the player with absurdly high-level gear and doing little to disguise the fact that it's essentially one big tribute to Nikita, a pulpy action thriller franchise about spies and shadow wars that is decidedly not high fantasy. I didn't really mind the unbalanced gear since I was playing it as endgame content anyway, and some of the fights were reasonably challenging for an endgame party. I assume it was designed for a new game, since the very last quest crashed when I played it with a save from an unmodified playthrough, but I didn't investigate this. Again, not a must-play, but I thought it was a fun diversion. The Drizzt Saga is another novelty mod, though it has a fair bit of content and incorporates a lot of assets from other Infinity Engine titles. After starting a new game, the player can head to where they'd usually find Drizzt Do'Urden, but this time they can join the legendary hero on a quest through fire and ice to rescue his companions and save Icewind Dale from dark forces. This is, as usual, a high-level adventure, and seems to be balanced around having a mage as the protagonist, unless you want to spend a lot of time looking for storekeeps and priests to identify items and stock up on immunity potions. Combat can be very challenging, as both Drizzt's party and your enemies have extremely high damage output, but not particularly effective tanking capabilities. You'll probably spend a lot of time reloading and pre-buffing for harder battles, but the fighting won't actually last that long before one side is wiped out. Most of the areas are just bloodbaths, but a few will require you to make use of Regis' thief skills. The maps are more ambitious than those of most other big mods, apparently splicing together bits and pieces of various pre-rendered backgrounds rather than copy-pasting the maps wholesale, but it does lead to some odd bugs with the map screen and a lack of consistency to the art. But hey, the animations are probably better than that new Dark Alliance game. The last big mod I tried was Stone of Askavar, which I think was made much later than any of the others. The party inadvertently clash with the forces of the dead god Bane, and are tasked by the Goodly Harpers with retrieving 6 powerful artifacts and liberating the Stone of Askavar from the clutches of the Baneites. There are a number of new areas open to the players, so again you'll need to start a new game for this mod. The new areas are very well made. I think some of the background art is made by the modders themselves, unless it's from some other game I don't recognise. Quests aren't so long as to wear out their welcome. Combat is a pretty good challenge for high-level parties without being too cheesy, and enemy spellcasters are scripted to use some very inventive tactics. Not really any role-playing content in this mod, but of all the big quest mods I tried, this was probably the most polished and faithful to the vanilla experience. It's definitely not something you have to install on a first playthrough, but I definitely enjoyed it. In terms of the smaller mods I would recommend for a first time playthrough, it's obviously a good idea to hunt down an unofficial fix pack for any outstanding issues not resolved by BioWare's official patches. I did several playthroughs for this video with the basic GOG release of the original saga, and didn't run into anything game-breaking, but it is worth installing the Sasha fix pack, which includes all the fixes from the classic Balderdash fix pack and more. I'd also recommend the Unfinished Business mod, which restores cut or partially implemented content, such as missing quests and dialogue, and the unfinished second level of the Ice Isle dungeon. It's not essential and it won't revolutionize your experience, but it's polished and fits nicely with the original game's content. Other than that, everything's down to your personal preference. There are tweak packs that let you modify aspects of the game you dislike, like the limited ammo stacking or randomized hit point gains, and there are mods that let you change the combat mechanics, or increase the difficulty, or add small quests that are less likely to break your playthrough than the heavy hitters mentioned above. You might be wondering why I haven't talked about the aforementioned mega mods that port Baldur's Gate 1 to the Baldur's Gate 2 engine. As I mentioned earlier, I have nothing against these ports, other than them deviating from the classic experience. I've actually played through both these versions at least 2 or 3 times over the years. Unfortunately, an unintended side effect of these mega mods is that they caused a split in the modding community. As the Baldur's Gate 2 engine is superior to that of the first games, some modders abandoned or completely ignored the original game to take advantage of the expanded capabilities of the Baldur's Gate 2 engine. This means that whilst most of the mods I've covered in this video have been ported to 2 or the Baldur's Gate trilogy, there are a number of mods designed for Baldur's Gate 1's campaign that can only be played in the Baldur's Gate 2 engine, so it would be odd to cover them in this video. That said, I'll quickly mention some of the most interesting. One of the most well-known is the BG1 NPC project, which brings companions of the first game in line with those of Baldur's Gate 2, making them much more interactive and reactive than their original versions. There are also several romance options for both male and female characters, so anyone who fantasized about being bullied by Shatiel can finally realize their dreams. I personally loved this mod, but people who found Baldur's Gate 2's companions annoying might want to skip it. There are also a number of interesting major quest mods that are designed specifically for 2 or Baldur's Gate trilogy. One is the recent Balduran's Sea Tower, which adds a major location that was noticeably absent from BioWare's version of Baldur's Gate. This is still in development, but it seems like something that would fit very well into Baldur's Gate 1's campaign and setting. The other big mod worth mentioning is the Northern Tales of the Sword Coast, which styles itself as an unofficial expansion in the vein of Dark Side of the Sword Coast. One thing that really intrigues me about this mod is that some areas are based on cut content and abandoned ideas from the original game, such as an unreleased demo for Baldur's Gate that would have had Agiantis and various other prototype companions investigating a Lovecraftian cult. Now, I haven't played either of these 2 big mods myself, but you might want to look into them. Finally, if you're playing Beamdog's Enhanced Editions, don't worry, you're not left out, as the vast majority of mods available for Baldur's Gate 1 or the Baldur's Gate 2 ports are also available for one version of the Enhanced Edition or another. Baldur's Gate has often been credited for kickstarting, or at least being partially responsible for the CRPG renaissance of the late 90s and early 2000s. Many critics at the time certainly thought of it as such, and mainstream gaming sites today refer to it as a game changer, or having saved CRPGs. But revisionists have challenged the narrative of Baldur's Gate's storied legacy. If Baldur's Gate was so influential, they ask, why did it have so few imitators? There were other Infinity Engine games, sure, but what else? Dragon Age Origins, perhaps, and of course the so-called Kickstarter renaissance of the mid-2010s that resulted in Obsidian's Pillars of Eternity and Owlcat's Pathfinder Kingmaker. It's questionable how much Baldur's Gate's real-time with pause system influenced turn-based titles like Temple of Elemental Evil or Divinity Original Sin, and though developers like Larian Software have cited the Baldur's Gate series as having influenced their own games, critics have suggested that this is just marketing talk. In 2019, Pillars of Eternity director Josh Sawyer reflected on the disappointing sales of the game's sequel, Deadfire, pondering whether many fans had enjoyed Pillars as a nostalgic throwback to the real-time with pause era, and then moved on to games they actually wanted. Meanwhile, Obsidian's other real-time with pause title, Tyranny, failed to meet its publisher's sales expectations. Now, Baldur's Gate certainly inspired BioWare itself. Later employees who joined the Mass Effect and Dragon Age teams, such as Cheryl Chi, credit Baldur's Gate for bringing them into the fold. And Obsidian's Fergus Urquhart has suggested that the reason Baldur's Gate spawned so few imitators is precisely because it proved that there were so many new directions in which developers could take the medium. That seems like a bit of a deflection to me. By that logic, fans of Baldur's Gate would have moved en masse to series like Mass Effect or The Witcher, which really ran with that concept of storytelling and narrative reactivity. In reality, plenty of Baldur's Gate fans bemoan the lack of similar titles today, and view BioWare's later games as either failures, or at least as fulfilling a very different need to the one that Baldur's Gate satisfied. But I think the question of Baldur's Gate's legacy is for another video. All I can say is that, for me, Baldur's Gate still retains its shine. It covers so many different facets of the adventuring experience. The dungeons, the journeying, and of course, the dealing of death. But it blends this engaging gameplay with solid writing, winsome companions, great music, and an immersive world. Though Baldur's Gate is often viewed in the context of the series as a whole, as the opening act of an epic saga, you can completely ignore the later entries and just enjoy the game on its own merits. By itself, Baldur's Gate is a fantastically deep and diverse slice of classic Dungeons & Dragons, and if you've never played it before, I hope this video has persuaded you to give it a chance.